In 1937, the United States government classified one of the most productive seed crops ever grown on American soil as a Schedule I narcotic. That single decision removed a plant that George Washington grew at Mount Vernon and recorded in his own diary, a plant that had been legally farmed on this continent for over 300 years, from every backyard, every farm, and every seed catalog in the country overnight. That was not an isolated event, and hemp was not the only seed. There are 15 seeds on this list. Some were banned outright. Some were patented by corporations so that nobody else could grow them freely. Some had their research buried, while cheaper, less effective alternatives were pushed into the market instead. Every single one of them, grown correctly in a backyard today, outperforms what most gardeners are currently spending money on. Stay with me until seed 11. What happened to that particular crop and who specifically made it happen is the most thoroughly documented case of commercial seed suppression in modern agricultural history. No speculation, just the paper trail. Let's open the file. Seed 1. Hemp. Let's start with the one that opened this video because the full story is almost never told correctly. Hemp and marijuana are the same species, Cannabis sativa, but dramatically different varieties with dramatically different chemistry. Hemp contains virtually no psychoactive compounds. You cannot get high from it. This was scientifically established and publicly known before 1937. It did not matter. What mattered to the people lobbying for its prohibition was what hemp could do commercially. It produced stronger fiber than cotton. Its seed oil outperformed many petroleum derivatives in industrial applications. DuPont had just patented nylon and held enormous commercial interest in a market that hemp threatened directly. William Randolph Hearst owned both timberland and the newspaper chains that amplified anti-cannabis messaging. He stood to lose significantly if hemp paper displaced wood pulp paper at scale. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the legislation that ended hemp farming in America, passed with almost no congressional debate. Testimony was heard from exactly 2 witnesses, a representative from the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics and a representative from the American Medical Association, who later stated publicly that he had been misled about what he was testifying against. In a backyard today, hemp cultivation is now legal in many regions with appropriate permits. Hemp seed is one of the most complete plant proteins available, more usable protein per gram than most legumes. A seed you can eat raw, press for oil, or grind into flour. The plant grows in poor soil, requires minimal water, and outcompetes weeds so aggressively it needs almost no pest management. This seed was not suppressed because it was dangerous. The documents prove it was suppressed because it was inconvenient to people with very large financial interests in the alternatives. Seed 2. Amaranth. This one goes back further than any government filing cabinet. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, amaranth was the 3rd most important food crop in Aztec civilization, behind only corn and beans. It fed millions of people. It was woven into religious ceremony. It functioned as currency. The Spanish crown banned it entirely. Growing amaranth became punishable by the removal of hands. The official reasoning was religious amaranth's role in Aztec ritual made it theologically inconvenient to the colonial administration. The practical result was this near-total erasure of a crop that produces more protein than wheat, thrives in soils too poor and dry for wheat to survive, handles drought that destroys corn harvests, and self-seeds reliably without replanting or purchased inputs. The crop survived only in isolated mountain communities across Mexico and South America, where colonial enforcement couldn't reach. It is now being rediscovered by growers who understand what they're actually holding. In a backyard, amaranth grows to 6 feet, produces seed in staggering quantities, and provides edible leaves from the same plant across the entire growing season, effectively 2 harvests from one sowing, from a crop that was actively hunted toward extinction and almost made it there. Seed 3. Stevia. Stevia is a leaf that is approximately 300 times sweeter than sugar by weight. 0 calories, no blood sugar spike. It has been used as a sweetener by the Guarani people of Paraguay for centuries. The FDA banned it in 1991. Not simply failing to approve it, issued a specific import alert classifying it as an unsafe food additive and ordering it removed from the market. 1 year before that ban, the NutraSweet company manufacturer of aspartame, then holding a dominant share of the American artificial sweetener market, had submitted a formal complaint to the FDA about stevia. The timeline between that complaint and the import alert was reported in the press and documented by researchers investigating regulatory capture in the food industry. The FDA maintained its position for over a decade. Stevia was finally approved as a food additive in 2008. By that point, the original NutraSweet patent had expired. Large food corporations had already acquired the commercial rights to process and sell stevia. It was no longer a competitive threat. It became a product. In a backyard, stevia grows as a perennial in warm climates and a reliable annual in cooler ones. The fresh leaf is the most potent form used directly in tea, dried and crumbled over food, or steeped into a liquid sweetener. No factory required. Seed 4. Neem. Neem has been documented in Indian agricultural practice for over 4,000 years. Ancient Sanskrit texts describe its applications as a pesticide, a soil treatment, a wood preservative, a medicine, and a fertilizer component. More uses catalogued across a longer period than most modern agricultural inputs can claim. In 1994, the European Patent Office granted W.R. Grace and Company, a U.S. chemical corporation, a patent on a method of using neem oil as a fungicide. The patent claimed ownership of a process that Indian farmers had been performing without interruption for 4 millennia. The Indian government and international farming coalitions spent a decade challenging it in court. They won. The patent was revoked in 2000, producing one of the most thoroughly documented cases of what researchers now call biopiracy, the corporate claiming of traditional agricultural knowledge as novel intellectual property. For a backyard grower, what cold-pressed neem seed oil provides is a natural pesticide that disrupts the reproductive cycle of over 200 insect species without harming birds, earthworms, or soil biology. Diluted and applied as a spray, it handles aphids, whitefly, fungal issues, and soil-borne pests simultaneously. 1 seed, 1 oil. It replaces a significant portion of what most gardeners spend on separate chemical inputs every single season. Seed 5. Quinoa. Quinoa was the sacred grain of the Inca civilization called Chisayamama, the mother of all grains. When the Spanish arrived in South America, they banned its cultivation for reasons almost identical to the Amaranth suppression in Mexico. Its ritual significance made it a politically inconvenient symbol of the culture they were attempting to erase. Its cultivation collapsed under colonization and stayed largely unknown outside Andean communities for 4 centuries. When the health food market rediscovered quinoa in the 1980s and 1990s, 2 American researchers filed a U.S. patent in 1994 claiming intellectual property rights over specific quinoa varieties developed across generations by Bolivian farming communities. Under the patent as filed, those Bolivian farmers would have been required to pay royalties to grow their own ancestral crop. International pressure from Bolivia and indigenous rights organizations forced the patent to be abandoned in 1998. The seed itself is one of the most complete plant proteins in existence, all essential amino acids in a single grain. It grows in poor, thin, high-altitude soil that most crops reject. It tolerates cold better than almost any other grain crop. And throughout the growing season, before the seeds even form, the leaves are edible and highly nutritious. The commercial battle over this crop was documented in detail. The crop itself was extraordinary, long before anyone outside the Andes paid attention. Seed 6. Black seed. Nigella sativa, called black seed or black cumin, though it's unrelated to standard cumin, has been cultivated continuously across the Middle East and North Africa for over 3,000 years. Seeds were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. Islamic tradition references it as a remedy for everything except death. It was not an obscure fringe crop. It was a staple. In the 1990s and 2000s, multiple U.S. patents were filed covering specific medicinal applications of black seed compounds, anti-tumor properties, immune-modulating effects, and blood sugar regulation. The traditional knowledge underlying these patents had been openly published in medical and botanical literature for decades. The patents claimed novelty, over properties that entire civilizations had already documented, tested, and passed down through recorded history. Several were challenged and partially revoked. The broader legal framework that allows corporations to file patents on traditional plant knowledge remains in place. In a backyard, black seed grows as an annual flowering plant that produces seed pods, drying naturally on the stem. The seeds are harvested directly, pressed into oil, or used in cooking. Across hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, consistent research confirms anti-inflammatory and immune-supporting properties that place this among the most evidence-backed functional seeds any home grower can produce. Seed 7. Comfrey. Comfrey was a standard fixture in European cottage gardens and farm medicine for centuries. Its folk name, knitbone, tells you what it was used for. The root and leaf were applied to wounds and fractures. It was eaten as a leaf vegetable and fed to livestock as a high-protein fodder crop. The FDA banned comfrey from all food and supplement products in 2001, citing liver toxicity concerns. The research underlying that concern came primarily from studies using isolated pyrrolizidine alkaloids, specific chemical extracts administered at doses far beyond anything achievable through normal food use of the plant. What almost no press coverage mentioned was this: comfrey as a garden input is completely unrestricted and represents one of the most effective soil fertility tools available to a backyard grower. Comfrey roots grow deep into subsoil layers that shallow-rooted vegetables cannot reach, drawing up minerals, potassium, phosphorus, calcium that would otherwise remain locked beyond plant access. Cut leaves composted into the bed or fermented into a liquid feed release those minerals into a form that tomatoes, squash, and root crops absorb immediately. A single comfrey plant in the corner of a productive garden functions as a permanent subsoil mineral pump. No commercial fertilizer replicates that mechanism. No restriction applies to using it that way. Seed 8. Breadfruit. In 1787, Captain William Bligh sailed HMS Bounty to Tahiti on a mission commissioned by British plantation owners in the Caribbean. The objective was to collect breadfruit plants and transport them to the West Indies to serve as cheap, high-calorie food for enslaved workers. The mutiny on the Bounty, one of the most famous events in British naval history, happened on that voyage. Bligh survived, completed a second expedition, and delivered the plants. The enslaved workers refused to eat breadfruit. Their refusal had nothing to do with the fruit. It had everything to do with the fact that their food supply was being controlled by the same system that controlled every other element of their lives. Breadfruit became a symbol of colonial dependency rather than a food of choice. And that association outlasted the institution that created it. The plant itself produces a large, starchy, highly nutritious fruit from a tree that, once established, yields year-round for decades with minimal maintenance. In tropical and subtropical climates, it is among the highest calorie food crops per square meter available from any tree. Its history is layered and troubling. Its productivity, stripped of that history and evaluated as a food plant in the hands of a grower who chooses it freely, is exceptional. Seed 9. Moringa. Moringa is not a historical case. It is a current one, and it is still unresolved. The moringa tree produces leaves with a nutritional profile so dense that it has been studied by international aid organizations as a structural solution to malnutrition in food-insecure regions. The comparative figures for higher protein concentration than yogurt, more iron than spinach, more calcium than milk, more vitamin C than oranges come from peer-reviewed nutritional analysis, not promotional literature. In several African countries where moringa grows natively and has been cultivated as a food crop for generations, documented cases exist in the academic literature on food sovereignty, showing that international agricultural development programs funded by Western governments and institutions have actively discouraged the commercialization of moringa in favor of imported fortified food products manufactured by commercial food companies based elsewhere. Whether this constitutes deliberate suppression or reflects misaligned development priorities driven by procurement systems that were never designed around local crops is a legitimate debate. What is not debatable? Moringa germinates in degraded, dry, nutrient-poor soil, produces harvestable leaves within weeks of planting, and delivers a nutritional return per square meter of growing space that no commercially promoted alternative in the same markets matches. The seed is available. The knowledge is available. The obstacles are institutional. Seed 10, milk thistle. Milk thistle. Silybum marianum has a documented history of use in liver support stretching back to ancient Greece. European herbal medicine used it continuously for 2,000 years for liver and gallbladder complaints. By the 20th century, researchers had identified the specific compound responsible for a flavonoid complex called silymarin and conducted clinical studies producing a substantial evidence base. In 1986, the German Commission E, the scientific body responsible for evaluating herbal medicines, officially approved milk thistle seed extract as a treatment for liver disorders. The evidence was considered sufficient for pharmaceutical-grade endorsement. In the United States, the FDA prohibits supplement manufacturers from making any equivalent health claim about milk thistle products, regardless of European approval, regardless of the volume of supporting research. The regulatory logic is that only drugs can carry treatment claims, and a natural seed cannot be classified as a drug unless a company funds the full approval process. That process costs hundreds of millions of dollars. No natural seed can generate the patent-protected commercial return that would justify that investment. The result, milk thistle is entirely legal to grow, sell, and buy, but legally impossible to accurately label with what decades of research says it does. In a backyard, it grows as a large, striking thistle, tolerant of poor soil, largely self-managing and self-seeding with minimal intervention. The seed heads are harvested, dried, and used directly. The restriction is on the label, not the plant. Seed 11. Papaya traditional varieties. This is the case I mentioned at the start. The paper trail is complete. In the late 1990s, the ring spot virus was causing a genuine agricultural crisis in Hawaiian papaya production, not a manufactured one. The threat was real. Researchers at Cornell University developed a genetically modified papaya variety designated rainbow papaya, engineered specifically to resist the virus. It was fast-tracked through regulatory approval and distributed to Hawaiian farmers at no cost. Within a few years, GM papaya dominated Hawaiian production, and traditional varieties had been effectively removed from commercial cultivation in most growing areas. Here is the documented problem. Organic papaya farmers who could not legally sell GM-contaminated produce to specific export markets they depended on found their non-GM seed supplies increasingly contaminated through cross-pollination from surrounding GM crops. Farmers who specifically selected traditional varieties and saved seed for replanting found themselves growing plants whose genetic profile had been altered without their knowledge or any consent process. The regulatory framework that approved and released the GM variety contained no mechanism for compensating or protecting farmers whose seed supply was changed by its uncontrolled spread. The evidence for this is not speculative. It exists in peer-reviewed literature, in Hawaiian state agricultural records, and in documented testimony from affected farmers. The case is closed evidentially. The broader question it raises about who owns the genetic integrity of a seed once a modified variety is released into an open growing environment has not been. Traditional papaya varieties, grown from carefully saved seed in a backyard setting away from GM cross-pollination sources, produce fruit with a flavor complexity that the engineered variety does not replicate. Growers who have grown both describe the difference as substantial. The seed is worth preserving. The case for preserving it is documented in the public record. Seed 12. Fenugreek. Fenugreek has been used continuously in Indian, Middle Eastern, and North African cooking and medicine for over 6,000 years. Clinical studies, not only folk tradition, document its effects on blood sugar regulation, digestive function, and milk production in nursing mothers. In 2011, a serious E. coli outbreak in Germany was traced to fenugreek sprout seeds imported from a specific supplier in Egypt. The European Food Safety Response imposed broad trade restrictions on fenugreek seed imports. Those restrictions were calibrated to industrial supply chains, not to individual seed producers, and small-scale traditional fenugreek growers in unconnected regions lost market access through a regulatory mechanism that made no meaningful distinction between them and the source of the outbreak. Grown in a backyard under controlled conditions, fenugreek is one of the most productive and genuinely multi-use seeds on this list. Leaves are harvested as a vegetable throughout the growing season. Seeds are dried and used whole as a spice or ground into a flavoring with a complex, slightly bitter profile found in a wide range of South Asian and North African cuisines. The plant fixes nitrogen into the soil as it grows and self-seeds readily with minimal management. The regulatory problems that affected it were real. None of them originated in the seed itself. Seed 13. Perilla. Perilla, both the green shiso and the red-leafed variety, has a 5,000-year history of cultivation across East and Southeast Asia. The seed, cold-pressed, produces a culinary oil with one of the highest plant-based omega-3 concentrations of any oil crop in regular cultivation. The fresh leaf is used in Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese cuisines in ways that have no satisfying substitute in Western cooking. In several U.S. states, perilla naturalized in the wild is classified as a noxious weed. The same species growing unchecked in livestock pastures is documented as toxic to cattle when consumed in large quantities. That classification creates genuine legal ambiguity around intentional cultivation for food use in those states, even though the food and the weed risk are entirely different contexts for the same plant. The practical result is that a seed crop with an extraordinary nutritional record and a culinary history longer than most European food traditions combined sits in a legal gray area in parts of the country where it would otherwise grow enthusiastically and productively. In regions where cultivation is clearly permitted, it is among the lowest maintenance oil and leaf crops a backyard grower can establish. It self-seeds readily, tolerates partial shade, and produces two distinct harvests, leaf throughout the season. Seed in autumn from a single planting. Seed 14. Lotus. The Lotus Nelumbo nucifera has been cultivated in Asia for over 3,000 years. Every part of the plant is edible: the seed, the root, the leaf, and the young stem. The seed specifically has a recorded viability that defies what most people understand as biological possibility. Seeds recovered from a dry lakebed in northeastern China and carbon dated to approximately 1,300 years old were successfully germinated under laboratory conditions. That is not a misprint or an exaggeration. It is a published, peer-reviewed result. In certain Western countries, lotus cultivation is restricted under invasive species legislation. The plant spreads aggressively in warm, still, shallow water and can displace native aquatic vegetation once established in open waterways. Those restrictions are ecologically reasonable in the specific environments they apply to. What gets lost in the restriction conversation is what the seed provides as a food crop. Young lotus seeds, eaten fresh, have a mild, slightly sweet flavor and a nutritional density of substantial protein, B vitamins, and minerals that makes them one of the more overlooked aquatic food sources available. In a sealed, contained water garden or a backyard pond designed to prevent spread, managed responsibly and in full compliance with local regulations, the lotus is one of the most visually extraordinary and genuinely productive aquatic food plants any grower can establish. The ecological concern is real. It applies to open waterways. It does not apply to a contained backyard pond. Seed 15. Watermelon heritage. Seeded varieties, not watermelon in general. Specifically, the seeded heritage varieties that commercial breeding has systematically removed from the market over the past 40 years. The seedless watermelon was not developed in response to consumer demand. Market research conducted across the period of its commercial introduction consistently showed that flavor, not convenience, not the presence or absence of seeds, was the primary purchase driver for watermelon buyers. The seedless variety was developed because it served the commercial supply chain. Easier to cut, easier to package, longer shelf life after cutting, more uniform sizing for retail display and pricing. There is a further commercial mechanism at work. To produce a seedless hybrid, a seeded parent variety must be present in the field to provide pollen for fertilization. This means commercial watermelon growers now depend practically and economically on purchasing fresh, certified hybrid seed every single season from the companies that develop and control those parent lines. Saving seed from a seedless watermelon is biologically futile. The resulting plant will not produce reliably. The seed-saving loop that farmers used for 10,000 years of watermelon cultivation has been broken. not by biology, but by commercial plant breeding explicitly designed to require annual purchasing. The seeded heritage varieties that commercial production has largely displaced are a different story entirely. The moon and stars, the Georgia rattlesnake, the Bradford watermelon, a variety that had not been commercially available for over a century before one family in South Carolina revived it from saved seed in 2012, producing fruit that won blind taste comparisons against modern commercial varieties without any contest. These are seeds carrying flavor profiles that commercial breeding is specifically selected against in favor of uniformity, shelf stability, and supply chain control. In a backyard with the space and the heat to grow watermelon, the heritage seeded varieties are the ones worth growing, not because they're old, because they taste substantially better, and because the seed in your hand at the end of the season means you never have to buy it again. 15 seeds, 15 different reasons. They faced restriction, patent claims, regulatory barriers, colonial bans, or outright criminal prohibition. And not one of them was suppressed because it didn't work. That is the single thread running through everything on this list. These seeds were inconvenient to a chemical company, to a colonial administration, to a trade relationship, to a regulatory system built entirely around the economics of industrial food production rather than the needs of a person growing food in their own soil. Your backyard sits outside most of that. The seed you save this season doesn't move through a supply chain. It doesn't need to survive a warehouse or satisfy a retail buyer. It doesn't threaten anyone's patent portfolio. It grows in your soil, produces food you chose to grow, and at the end of the season, it produces more seed. That is not a small thing. In the context of what this list documents, it is precisely the point. Subscribe to Rickard Backyard Garden. Every week, the growing knowledge that actually matters, researched, explained clearly, and without filler. See you in the next one.